Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the 4th episode of Just Eco. So, on today's episode, we'll be talking about visual rhetoric and visual imagery and how to use social media. Organizations use visuals to entice people or get people to think differently about the topic of climate justice. So my first question is to you, Ari, and I want to start out by saying that visual rhetoric means pragmatically to persuade and constitutively to construct or challenge a particular quote-unquote seeing of nature or what constitutes as an environmental problem. So my question to you is, how can environmental organizations use visual rhetoric to explain the topic of climate justice to the public and to people?
So Food and Water Watch's social media voice is what we like to call outraged academic. So that means that we're bringing an emotional appeal to very nuanced and interconnected topics, so that way people can understand and connect to them. And the style that we kind of do that through is by using engaging moments and showing those to actually drive people to action. And another way we do that is by sharing those moments on our social media. That's great questions. So like I mentioned, we have a national and a regional social media program. So we have Facebook and Twitter pages for our C3 and C4 national organizations, and then an Instagram page for Food and Water Watch, which is our C3. We also have a national TikTok. And in addition to those pages, we have regional Facebook and Twitter pages that are managed by our regional organizers who are all over the country. So we generally will use our C3 national pages for more general content and our C4 national pages for direct or grassroots lobbying. And how we're defining lobbying in this case is when we're advocating for a specific policy position or a piece of legislation, as well as targeting a specific candidate. But there's definitely some gray area around things like tweeting at an elected official's government versus campaign account. So we are generally really careful on the C3 during election years, and we won't tag a campaign account during those times just because we have to be super careful. Our philosophy on our social media is kind of a two-pronged approach. And so we see social media as an important piece of helping us win our pillar campaigns. We first educate our audience about important issues like why we need to ban fracking in a way that's easily understandable but still doesn't completely water down our message. All of you are already well educated on the issues, and so sharing educational content is something that you can do on your own pages to help further educate a broader constituency. So after getting folks educated and fired up about the issues, in our case, food, water, and climate, the second piece of our approach is that we're hoping to bring people down the funnel from someone who likes or retweets a post to someone who will sign a petition, show up at a protest, or maybe even donate to our organization. So in terms of the actual content that we'll post to get people there, one of the things we make sure to do is capture and share content from real world events. So by showing people that we're actually out there on the ground and trying to inspire meaningful change, this can help inspire them to become part of the movement themselves. We're also not afraid to digitally bird dog members of Congress, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a second. So we're using our social media channels not only to communicate with the public, but to communicate with elected officials. So I want to show an example from a recent action that we did in New Jersey. So you can see a screenshot of part of the post there. So in this post, we used photos from a peaceful demonstration that we did with local allies to show our team in action. We showed up at an event in New Jersey with Energy Secretary Granholm and Rep. Frank Belloni, and some of our volunteers actually physically blocked cars in their motorcade. And that's a really powerful visual, right? So in this post, there's literally visual evidence of the fact that we're willing to take risks and block business as usual. So our audience is learning not just what we're fighting for, but how we fight for it. Our strategy is to share a lot of photos like this on our social media channels. So we're really telling the story of our activism. And I also want to note too that this post is on our C3 page because even though we were directly lobbying elected officials at the event itself, the photos and the post copy themselves are pretty vague in terms of policy or legislation that would be needed to meet our demands to ban fracking. So this post kind of walks the line between C3 and C4 compliance. And obviously, you know, if in-person demonstrations or events are something that your organization is doing right now, or if you're just an individual who's attending demonstrations, this should be pretty straightforward for you to recreate on your own social media. Just make sure to take lots of photos and videos at these events and then share them on social media with captions that tell the story of what you were doing and why. You can then follow this up with later posts about how to take action or content about how to take action. Another example that I want to show on the next slide, and there's a few different tweets, so I think we can just kind of tweet through them as I'm talking about these. But another example is from a recent campaign we did on Food and Water Watch's Twitter, where we digitally bird dogged members of Congress and asked them to sign on to a letter calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies. And so when I say digital bird dogging, what that basically means is that we're going to tweet at them relentlessly with our messaging. So for this campaign, we created a list of about a dozen members in Congress that were members of important committees that we wanted to target. And our goal was to get them to sign on to a letter voicing their objection to fossil fuel subsidies. We chose to do this on our C3 account since it is in kind of a gray area because we're talking directly to elected officials and we're not asking them to endorse specific legislation, but rather sign on to a letter. So we targeted their government Twitter handles for this, since all of the folks we targeted had both government and campaign accounts, and also because we generally try to only target campaign accounts if we're posting or tweeting on the C4. So this effort was pretty successful for us, and we ended up with 52 members of Congress total signing on to the letter against fossil fuel subsidies, and that was largely with the help of some annoying tweets. So the good thing about a campaign like this is it's relatively easy to execute. You would just need to come up with a list of targets, write some sample tweets with your demands, and then pick a specific time to tweet them out. You can do this over the course of a day or several. You just want to make sure that you're sending tweets pretty frequently, so it's creating kind of a flurry of notifications in your target's inbox. Another good idea is if you're going to do something like this is to come up with a short, simple, and unique hashtag for your campaign. If there's not one that already exists that you can use. One example of one that's already existing that we use a lot is hashtag ban fracking. And having a hashtag just makes it easy to see when any partners that you've partnered with share content. So that way you can retweet it or like it and just kind of generally lift the content up. But that's kind of the examples that I have, and just sort of a overview of our social media persona at Food and Water Watch. I know Kate mentioned.
So my last question is to you, Jessica, and I'll start out by saying that visual imagery is where you can stimulate the imagination on further steps which the community can take. So how can people or people who work in environmental organizations use visual imagery to get people to think differently or to want to tackle the issue when it comes to the topic of climate justice?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica, and I'm a climate justice activist, climate change educator, and writer. I'm from Poland originally, and I'm now based in Wales in the UK. Just a little bit about my work. I got involved in climate activism during my psychology degree in London, and I initially started researching which personality traits lead to pro-environmental behaviour. And I then realised that it's not so much about who we are, but the messaging we're exposed to and the kind of environments we find ourselves in. So I decided that I didn't want to work as a psychologist, and I pursued a master's degree in climate change impact and adaptation, where I focused on climate change communication and the role of values in pro-environmental behaviour and systems change. The interesting thing about values is that they're fluid and they can change depending on who we spend time with, where we work or study, or even depending on the media we consume. How we communicate climate change is of crucial importance if we want to shift people's values towards those which favour environmental protection, degrowth, and a shift away from capitalism. I've also been involved with a range of environmental organizations against new fossil fuel development and raising awareness of environmental racism, indigenous land rights, and a variety of other causes. At the end of this month, I'll start working for Green Alliance, which is the leading environmental think tank in the UK, to bridge the gap between science and government action. Next slide, please. So climate change communication is extremely important because we still see very high rates of climate denial. A recent survey in the UK showed that only 38% of people believe that climate change is primarily caused by human activity, and that figure is similar in the United States. Climate denial has a long history, especially in the US, and since the early days of climate change science in the 1960s, the fossil fuel industry has paid scientists to produce studies which play down or deny the effects or even the reality of climate change. This is still happening today, with the most prominent example being the Heartland Institute, but nowadays, luckily, it's happening on a much smaller scale. Climate denial is most often fueled by misinformation in the media, and many news channels give a disproportionate amount of airtime to denialist views as opposed to legit scientists, although denialist views represent less than 1% of scientific opinion. The recent IPCC report has stated that climate change is unequivocally caused by human activity, which is a very strong statement. So usually we have a slight error margin in science, but we're pretty sure about this. Climate change now has many different facets today, and it does not necessarily mean an outright denial that climate change is real. Only 1% of people in the UK believe that the climate is not changing, and only about 5% of people in the US. This number used to be a lot higher, but we can thank the rigorous research of the IPCC report and the work of climate activists and public figures such as Al Gore in the US for rapidly changing public opinion in recent decades. However, climate denial manifests in more insidious ways these days, and these three are the most common ones. Firstly, greenwashing. Greenwashing basically means that companies pretend to be more environmentally friendly than they actually are. For example, if you look at Shell or Exxon's Instagram, for example, pretty much everything they talk about is how much carbon they're sucking out of the atmosphere, how many sustainable initiatives they're part of, and it's a really warped picture which doesn't really take into account the harm they're causing to ecosystems and communities. Secondly, weight-washing is a more recent strategy in which the fossil fuel industry capitalized on the rise of environmental justice movements. A lot of the people featured in fossil fuel ads and their social media accounts are people of color, which completely disregards the fact that those communities are most affected by environmental racism and land degradation perpetrated by those industries. Lastly, climate delay is often employed by industries and corporations to make the climate crisis seem less urgent than it actually is. This strategy often happens in tandem between industries and government, which ultimately means that governments don't follow up on their climate action goals. To illustrate that, the UK government has one of the most ambitious emission reduction targets in the world. I believe it's 78% by 2030. But our actual policies reduce CO2 emissions at only a quarter of the rate that they should. And as it stands, the UK investment in the green recovery per capita is only a very small fraction of that of the United States, which would have been unthinkable just a year ago. And it really shows that radical changes in policy are possible on a fairly short timescale. Next slide, please. It's important to note that misinformation is not the only factor contributing to climate denial. And that's when we need to talk about climate doomism. I do a lot of climate communication work on social media, and how we frame our messages is super important if we want to ensure that people act upon them. The reason I introduced this talk speaking about climate denial, apart from the fact that it's important to recognize and understand it, is that climate doomism is in fact a type of climate denial. And many media outlets and corporations engage in doomism to discourage people from acting on the climate crisis. Next slide, please. After the recent IPCC report, we saw a lot of climate doomism in the media, as these headlines demonstrate. This is a post I made on Instagram a few weeks back, and I just want to invite you to have a brief look for a moment and register how they make you feel. After the recent IPCC report, we saw a lot of climate doomism in the media, as these headlines demonstrate. This is a post I made on Instagram a few weeks back, and I just want to invite you to have a brief look for a moment and register how they make you feel. Now we're going to compare these to some more nuanced headlines. That's great, thank you. As a climate activist, it can be very tempting to sound the alarm bell, and we have a lot of reasons to do so. However, from a psychological perspective, this can often be counterproductive. Climate change is an existential threat, but from an evolutionary perspective, we've evolved to react to threats in 3 specific typical ways. Next slide, please. And those reactions are categorized as fight, flight, and freeze reactions. When we engage in climate doomism, our audience is very likely to react in one of these 3 ways, or a combination of them, depending on their personal history, their current environmental factors, and even genetic factors. Here we can see some examples. For instance, a lot of people still engage in the flight response. This can be climate denial, but it can also be avoidance of the topic, or distraction. This could look like extreme materialism, climbing the corporate ladder, or claiming that you're too busy to engage with climate change. And this is the response most of us will be familiar with. Other people may fight and dedicate themselves to activism to the point of burnout. Those people might themselves engage in doomist messaging, and they can be labelled aggressive, alarmist, and judgmental by other people. Also, putting long hours into activism is not sustainable. I've been there myself, I've suffered from burnout, and it's really not contributing to the cause at all. Very often, people experience the freeze response, which often comes with detrimental effects on their mental health. People may be overwhelmed and unable to act, and in this state we can experience conditions such as eco-anxiety, which many of you might be familiar with, depression, grief, and despair. Again, they're all not very conducive to action. Next slide, please. So, how are we supposed to communicate climate change on social media? It can be a tricky one, but from a psychological point of view, these 3 factors are the most important ones. Firstly, focus on possibilities rather than threats. Activism works, and whenever a success happens, it's really important to celebrate it. For example, in early 2020, I joined Extinction Rebellion in blocking a coal mine in England. And as a result, plans for an expansion of the coal mine were dropped. This is only one example of many I've personally witnessed, and I think it's really important to be vocal about those victories in order to inspire other people. Secondly, this is a bit cliche, but be hopeful. People are a lot more inspired by hope rather than fear, and while it's important to stress the threat that climate change poses, our focus should be on what we can do about it. And lastly, hold the media accountable. Humans have evolved to pay more attention to negative messaging as a survival instinct, and the media really relentlessly exploit this fact. There's a lot of power in complaining to the media as a member of the public for the ways in which they frame and relay the climate crisis. And if you work in media, you can also use this knowledge to push for change within the industry. Next slide, please. Lastly, when we talk about communicating climate change on social media, it's really important to make it accessible. For those of us who work in the environmental sector or engage in activism, it can be really easy to forget that most people don't understand climate change very well. And this is why I want to conclude this talk with a few simple rules or tips for using social media as a tool to spread the climate message. Firstly, make it relevant. We probably all know the saying, think global, act local, but actually from a psychological perspective, this is not necessarily true when it comes to climate action. People are a lot more likely to start caring about global climate change when they see its effects on the local scale. And therefore, it's very important to get people involved in their local communities. For example, this can look like maintaining the local park or protecting a local endangered species. And this can then often spill over and develop into more wide-reaching action and activism. Secondly, be concise. We're constantly bombarded with information from many different sources, and our capacity to absorb new information is very limited. As a starting point, it's important to explain climate science in simple terms and then link to resources explaining it more in depth. Thirdly, avoid confusing terminology. Accessible language is everything when we want to include more people in the climate movement. For example, instead of carbon sequestration, you can say sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, or just make sure you define this term first before you use it in any context. I found climatejargon.ie a really great resource, and they basically explain common climate terms in plain English, and I've linked them here on this slide. Next, make your communication action-oriented. Start on a small scale with accessible actions, for example, changing your bank or who you vote for. For people who are more open and able to change their lifestyle, you can suggest more challenging actions such as changing one's diet or driving less. For those who are open to contributing both time and effort, you can suggest joining a local campaign group or starting their own campaign group. Lastly, and most importantly, we have to listen to our audience and other people. Find out what people's barriers are in engaging with climate change and shape your communication around them. For example, I did that with question stickers on my Instagram stories, and I just asked people, what do you perceive as the biggest barriers? It's important to remember that every single one of us is an influencer. It doesn't matter whether you have thousands of followers, whether you're a school teacher, for example, or whether you just talk about climate change at family gatherings. People have always been influenced by other people's opinions and knowledge, and all of us have our own spheres of influence. So it's all about learning what your spheres are and how to use them. That's pretty much all from me. I want to end by recommending are more open and able to change their lifestyle. You can suggest more challenging actions such as changing one's diet or driving less. For those who are open to contributing both time and effort, you can suggest joining a local campaign group or starting their own campaign group. Lastly, and most importantly, we have to listen to our audience and other people. Find out what people's barriers are in engaging with climate change and shape your communication around them. For example, I did that with question stickers on my Instagram stories, and I just asked people, what do you perceive as the biggest barriers? It's important to remember that every single one of us is an influencer. It doesn't matter whether you have thousands of followers, whether you're a school teacher, for example, or whether you just talk about climate change at family gatherings. People have always been influenced by other people's opinions and knowledge, and all of us have our own spheres of influence. So it's all about learning what your spheres are and how to use them. That's pretty much all from me.
So that's all the questions that I have for today, but is there anything else that you would like to say on the topic that we are discussing today, Ari or Jessica?
All of that. The other thing I would add is just kind of when we are thinking about what channels we're posting on, we're also thinking about what type of audience we have on each channel. So our Facebook tends to skew toward women over 65. That is the audience that generally follows us on Facebook. So when we're thinking about the content that we share, we're thinking about what resonates with those folks that are on that channel. On Twitter, our audience tends to skew more toward men, and men who are kind of in that middle age range, that like kind of 40 or so age range. So when we're thinking about that content, we're thinking about what resonates with that channel. And then Instagram and TikTok are very much our younger folks, where they're kind of already engaged with those channels, so they follow us there. I see a question from all of that. The other thing I would add is just kind of when we are thinking about what channels we're posting on, we're also thinking about what type of audience we have on each channel. So our Facebook tends to skew toward women over 65. That is the audience that generally follows us on Facebook. So when we're thinking about the content that we share, we're thinking about what resonates with those folks that are on that channel. On Twitter, our audience tends to skew more toward men, and men who are kind of in that middle age range, that like kind of 40 or so age range. So when we're thinking about that content, we're thinking about what resonates with that channel. And then Instagram and TikTok are very much our younger folks, where they're kind of already engaged with those channels, so they follow us there. I see a question from something that we're really always trying to do and always trying to get creative about. I think with social media, you're always sort of dealing with the challenge of what does well in the algorithm and trying to balance that with trying to get your message out, because if your content isn't doing well on your social media, you know, it doesn't get pushed up in the algorithm and then no one sees it, right? It's kind of like the tree falls in a forest thing. So we're always trying to do new things, whether that's different tactics on Twitter, joining in on tweet storms on Twitter, trying new graphics and memes on Facebook and Instagram. We need to post more on TikTok, I will admit. So we're really just kind of always trying to do new things to reach new people, and thinking about audience when we're doing those things. That is a great question. So there are actually some really great free tools out there to create graphics for social media. One that hopefully some of you have heard about, but if not, I would love to talk about it, is Canva. So Canva is a super easy to use and free tool that allows you to create images that you can post on your social media channels. So, you know, in the past, people had to have access to fancy editing software like Adobe Creative Suite, but that's really not the case anymore, and anyone can try their hand at design. So the great thing about Canva is you can kind of build things from scratch if you already have some design experience. Sorry, my puppy is barking. If you already have some design experience, you can build your own things, or they also have templates that you can work off of. So those can be super helpful if you're looking for content for your social media channels. And yes, Tamara, I love Canva too. Like, I could talk about Canva all day. So likewise, that is a great question. So there are actually some really great free tools out there to create graphics for social media. One that hopefully some of you have heard about, but if not, I would love to talk about it, is Canva. So Canva is a super easy to use and free tool that allows you to create images that you can post on your social media channels. So, you know, in the past, people had to have access to fancy editing software like Adobe Creative Suite, but that's really not the case anymore, and anyone can try their hand at design. So the great thing about Canva is you can kind of build things from scratch if you already have some design experience. Sorry, my puppy is barking. If you already have some design experience, you can build your own things, or they also have templates that you can work off of. So those can be super helpful if you're looking for content for your social media channels. And yes, Tamara, I love Canva too. Like, I could talk about Canva all day. So.
Well, that's all I have for today. Thank you all for coming, Ari and Jessica. And thank you everyone for tuning into the 4th episode of Just Eco.